Okay. Hello, everyone. I am Luba Vangelova, the founder of the Hub, and I am here today talking with Chris and Holly Santillo, who are the authors of this book called Resilience Parenting. So they will be talking with me today about resilience. So first and foremost, could you tell us just briefly who you are and why is resilience an important enough topic for you that you decided to invest the time and energy to write a whole book about it?
Sure, thank you, and good to be here.
Excellent to be here. Thank you, Luba. So yes, I'm Holly, this is Chris, and we met in California shortly after graduating from college. Long time ago. Got into martial arts together and became martial arts teachers. That has been our business. Loved it so much, the teaching aspect, watching people make their lives more like they wanted it to be. Just watch people transform, and I mean kids and adults alike. But especially it was wonderful to watch kids who had trouble coming out of their shell, or maybe kids who were particularly out of their shell needed to go back inside that shell a little more to watch them become more functional with relationships with their parents and the rest of the community. Yeah.
And so I think what we wanted to do with this book was to take the lessons relevant to parenting, all of the lessons from martial arts instruction, because as I think many people recognize, there's a lot of contribution that martial arts has towards raising children with functional, fulfilling lives, independent and connected children, and see if what of those lessons we could take from the martial arts studio and present them to parents as something that they can incorporate into their parenting, and whether or not they happen to be martial artists or not. And so that's the genesis of resilience parenting, is taking the lessons of the martial arts and applying them to parenting at large.
Okay, and if you could also just set the context of the fact that you're on your own parenting journey as well, and kind of on a broader education journey as well, even beyond martial arts. If you could just tell us a little bit about that.
Yeah, we do have our own 3 little test cases, ages 8, 10, and 11 now, 3 boys. And then our own journey, we all kind of catch ourselves wherever we are. And about 1.5 years ago, we sold everything we owned and we started traveling around the world nomadically. So we've been around the Northern Hemisphere once, and we were working our way around the Southern Hemisphere when, in the midst of 2020, the whole world ground to a halt. So our trip's a little bit on a hiatus right now, but we'll resume whenever the universe allows it. And that's been a really good opportunity for us and our children to kind of experience life in a broader sense and to test out resilience in more ways than one.
Okay. And so how do you define resilience and why is it important?
So we've broken it down to 3 pieces: strength, adaptability, and recovery. Why is it important? Well, Luba, we might have the life of our dreams, but there are always things that happen in the world, unexpected cataclysms, small or large, and we have to be practiced at the art of resilience. It's an art to practice, right? We have to be able to dust ourselves off again if we fail. We have to be able to be strong if we think that our track is the right one and we need to hold steadfast to it. And then when we realize it's not, we have to be able to adapt. So resilience, I think that everyone would agree it's a good idea, but that's a good question. Why is that?
In a broader sense, resilience protects our lives from all of the things that inevitably happen, and whether it happens to be a scraped knee or not making the high school football team or a worldwide pandemic, whatever kind of things upset our otherwise smooth flowing life, we need to be able to deal with them. And as Holly said, it's 3 levels. There's strength of when you just need to power through whatever's in front of you, adaptability when it's too much to power through and you need to adjust to it. And then of course there's the dust yourself off and get back up again and try again when you inevitably get knocked down. And it's kind of those 3 different levels, and resilience is all of those, and being well practiced at deploying whatever is the appropriate response, and being able to continue forward in a broader sense towards your life goals.
Okay. And so could you break that down a little bit about when do you power through something and when do you pivot? Because I've heard many parents say that they feel it's important for their children to stick with something once they're like enrolled in something, once they're, working on some project or whatever, that the parents feel it's very important that they then see it through. Otherwise, they're not really learning a good life lesson. So when do you power through, and when is powering through actually not the best course? And when is you said adapting. When does one adapt instead of powering through?
Well, it's a great question.
What comes to my mind is integrity. I know we're going to probably get into the three pillars before too long here, but one of them is integrity. And it's knowing when, well, first of all, with regard to your specific question about kids and sticking with something, it helps if you make an agreement that's well stated in advance of what it is that you are setting forth to accomplish. And having integrity with that goal is much easier if you set your expectations clearly with each other. And what were you thinking?
But you also, I think you laid the groundwork really well with your question, Luba. The answer is not always to power through. That's not always the right answer. I think, and forgive me that I can't quote it directly, but one of my favorite Winston Churchill quotes is praising the virtue of giving up. Because sometimes the right answer is to give up. If you put yourself on a particular course of action, whether it's a career track or whether it's a course of study at college, or whether it's a sport that you took up or whatever, like sometimes the right answer is quitting. And sometimes the right answer is powering through. And we say quitting, pivoting is a much, I love your use of the term pivoting. We say adapting, of course, because that is part of the martial arts parlance. But in business and school, of course, we always talked about pivoting, very trendy right now. And sometimes that's the right answer and sometimes it's not. I don't know if I can offer a really broad answer beyond the fact that sometimes you should do one and sometimes you should do the other. And we as parents need to help our children make these choices responsibly and in an informed way. If your kid goes to soccer practice and they don't get to play very much and they get frustrated and they skin their knee and they come home and they say, I hate soccer, I never want to play again. And you say, okay, well then let's just pull you out of soccer. That's probably the wrong thought process is probably winning out there, as opposed to, well, then maybe we need to practice more, maybe we need to do this more. Like that might be a better chance to start talking about adapting and finding another, or powering through, sorry. But if there's a systemic underlying reason why this course of action doesn't make sense, then it's time to adapt. And so there are definitely going to be cases, and we as parents, part of our responsibility is to teach our children how to make these decisions intelligently and in most cases unemotionally.
That's good, yeah. Unemotional, acute versus chronic, I think you brought up. That we can get caught up in little details rather than it's not an overall problem, an overarching problem, but just you had a rough day.
Yeah.
Right. And not bending and breaking because of that.
Mm-hmm. Okay. And so you mentioned about the role of the parents is to help the children make these decisions wisely and unemotionally. So let's talk a little bit more about that parent-child dynamic and the importance of the role of the parents. So, and first of all, is it ever too early or too late to start cultivating resilience in children?
Absolutely not.
Today would be the best time. 20 years ago would have been the ideal time. What's that old saying, that the best time to have planted a tree was 20 years ago, but the second best time is right now. Right. And I think that applies to parenting and all of our best practices. Earlier would have been better, but now.
We're not done creating our own selves. Why would we be done creating them? People we are trying to help grow up.
Right.
True. I'm still working on my own resilience.
That's right.
So then the role of the parent, could you talk about that? You describe the role of the parents in your book as the children's primary teachers, but kind of in the sense of a broader sort of comprehensive life education. It doesn't mean that they necessarily need to teach their children everything. Like, what is the role of outside the family teachers, and what's the role of parents as teachers? How do you kind of delineate those?
So the parents will outsource whatever needs to be outsourced. And that's going to vary by family. And it's also honestly going to vary by what resources are available to the family, what community. If there's a good school nearby, or there's a good soccer program nearby, or there's a good, martial arts program nearby, all of the different things that you might bring into the choir of people that are helping to raise the village of people that are helping to raise your children. The important thing that we want to emphasize is that ultimately the responsibility lies with the parent. And so if you find a wonderful football program that cultivates sportsmanship, and it cultivates teamwork, and it does all of those wonderful things, then you've accomplished that, and you've made sure that you brought that piece to your children that's important for their development. However, if you don't have that, then you need to find either an alternative source or need to provide it yourself. And so we're absolutely in favor of parents outsourcing all the different aspects of parenting that they can, so long as they keep the finger on the pulse of the whole situation and make sure that all the boxes are getting checked. And then to your broader question, we talk a lot about the 3 R's, right? Reading, writing, arithmetic. Do we still say it that way? I don't know. People do. And but even more important than that, and I don't want to diminish the importance of those cores and the STEM curriculum and all of the other academic aspects of our children's upbringing, but developing children with a strong sense of values is critically important. That communicating our values and sending children into the world that have those. I met a father one time, and he had these 3 wonderful teenage kids, and they were just lovely children. And I asked him about his parenting methodology, and we had a wonderful chat one evening. And he clearly had given it a lot of thought, because his answer was well thought out in advance. And it was very simple. He said, I have 18 years to raise children who are curious and honest. And those were his buzzwords. Though that's what he wanted. He wanted to raise children who were going to be honest, who had lived their lives with integrity, but also were very curious about the world around themselves. And I thought that although that's not a perfect reflection of the values that were, though they're encapsulated, it's not exactly what we're communicating to our children. I think that he did a really good job of capturing that and raising children. We saw 3 of them in their teenage years, and I think he was doing a pretty darn good job of doing that, because he was doing it intentionally.
Mm-hmm. Okay. And in your book, you mentioned that children want to do well and that they want to learn from their parents. Now, some parents may not feel that way. They may feel like, my child doesn't seem to want to learn anything from me. All I get is pushback and whatever. So can you just talk a little bit about that? If that's the parent's perception, what might be underlying that?
Yeah, we talked about this, Chris and I, earlier today, that it's somewhere the relationship between child and parent broke down, and it could be for any number of reasons.
The reason she says that is that we taught our children how to walk. We taught them how to talk. They loved learning from us in their first couple of years, almost universally.
I have never heard
not the case,
say my kid won't listen to me as I'm trying to teach him how to eat, or I don't know,
or talk or walk, whatever.
Yeah.
But if that was the case then, and they don't want to learn now, then something in the intervening time has broken down.
Mm-hmm.
And so the question then is, how do we restore that? And of course, because there's so many different ways that relationship might have broken down in that sense, then there's so many different ways to repair it. But I think that going back and trying to see that shift and try to figure out what happened, like when did the feedback and the positive encouragement that you gave that child who was learning how to eat or learn how to walk, how did that transform into the relationship and the dynamic that you now have? And of course, relearning habits and relearning ways of interacting are difficult, but obviously the consequences for not doing so and the ups are so great, and the upside for doing so, doing it correctly, is so wonderful.
I want to go back and wrap a little bit more on the parents as teachers, because this is the part of the book that I feel most passionate about. And it's because I love teaching. I love teaching my kids. I love teaching all kids, just about anything. there is just an amazing relationship between parents and kids when they're working as teacher and student, because you are inspiring your children rather than requiring or demanding or disciplining. It's a relationship based on communication, desire to learn, desire to do well. Like you said, I really do think that we're all out to do well. It never feels good to fail in someone's eyes. So if your child continually is failing in your eyes, it might just be that they think they can't succeed in your eyes. For, I'm just guessing. It could be many things, right? But in the book, there are a lot of very specific actions that you can take to help develop the communication that teachers and students have together. And that's what I think we were trying to give to parents, not just the theory of like, okay, great, I need to be a teacher. I don't know how to do that. But here's how you communicate with your kids on the eye level. Here's how you get their attention. Here's how you make sure.
That's the entire third section of the book.
That's right. You're talking about things that matter rather than constantly having conversations about the things that really don't. Although it's like keeping your house tidy, keeping your kids bathed, for instance. All that. I do think that trying to work on that relationship of parents and kids as teachers and students is going to help solve a lot of what you're asking.
And so just diving a little deeper into that, you mentioned the importance of striking a balance between fostering independence and maintaining connection with your children, and how in a lot of cases parents tend to kind of be at one end of that, and kind of that it's not in balance. So especially, I mean, I think parents would understand about kind of the fostering independence. I mean, that's a little, I think, easier to grasp because there's been a lot of articles about helicopter parenting and, wrapping children in bubble wrap. And I think parents understand, although it would be interesting, I think, to share your perspective on, because there is also the parental urge to intervene and shield your children from harm. So can you talk about, just briefly, where do you draw the line between like a good example of helping and then an example that is actually in the long term not so helpful?
Sure. Well, you're absolutely right. There's a lot of helicopter parenting, and it's obviously, just because we all make fun of it in the news doesn't mean that it's gone away. Like it exists. Snowplow parenting was the other one I ran across a couple of years ago. That this idea of overprotecting our children has not gone away, even if many of us have recognized the downside. So,
yeah.
And so it's still very much there. So the first thing I want to say is you talked about the about the independence and the connectedness. And there is, I believe, a mistaken belief, a false choice that people often make, feeling that they're a dichotomy and that one comes at the expense of the other. And the first thing we want to say before having a conversation on the subject is make sure that people understand there is no choice to be made between the two. That the happiest and most successful people are the people who are both independent and connected both. And by connected, we mean connected to our friends, family, and the community around ourselves. And by independent, we mean able to act volitionally on their own, independent of other people's judgment when it is appropriate. And so if you have a person who is very independent but hasn't developed a lot of connection, on their 18th birthday, they're gone. They don't call home, they don't check in, they're gone. And which is an extreme example, of course, but we all have seen variants of that. And then the very connected but not independent is the person who, mom has to walk him to his first class at college because and yells at his roommate because his roommate did such and such. Relationships, or what's the worst one? I think the 24-year-old whose mom showed up at a job interview.
Right. So
these are kind of extreme examples, but that's what we mean by a person who is clearly connected, but lacks independence. And then, of course, it manifests itself in smaller ways throughout the course of our childhood.
So where do you draw the line to?
So yeah, no, absolutely. So step one is recognizing that the goal is never to withdraw one of those, but rather to build up whatever needs to be built up. So if you have that child who you picture 18 years from now, or not 18 years, or when they turn 18, leaving and not without a forwarding address, you don't need to work on independence with that child. That's fine. They've got that clearly. You need to work on connection. You need to work on that relationship. You need to work on developing their community within yourselves and their friends and their community, helping them have a connection, helping them have a relationship worth working on, or having a relationship worth. And if you have that other child, the one that you kind of picture at 24 asking you to help them with their job interview, then clearly you need to work on independence. And then you asked also more specifically, because it's the independence that people come back to, I think, very often, is finding challenges and acceptable losses. So we always joked about maiming and death.
I was just going to say maiming or death.
Maiming
That's
and
all
death.
you needed to know, Luba. The line is maiming or death.
Right. So, right. So we have to look at the consequences. We talked, Holly and I, again, were talking about this earlier today, that all the children out there have very different experiences in stressors in their life. Some children are raised in households with very few stressors. Some are raised with a lot of stressors. Our role as parents, to the extent that we can, is to present an age-appropriate level of stress to our children.
Mm.
And that age-appropriate level of stress is never zero, and it's also never full tilt. And
because you want to make it challenging, but not overwhelming. Overwhelming is when your kids are breaking down in tears. You've gone too far, right? But if they're constantly smooth sailing and never really frustrated or challenged, frustrated is not a good thing. It's challenged. When they have to work hard, that's good. Resilience is like a muscle. If it doesn't get used, if you don't practice it, it atrophies, and you won't have it when you absolutely need it. So you have to create that soccer practice that they didn't want to go to. You have to keep hammering away at it so that they get an opportunity to practice it in a safe, non-maiming or death environment. And then it's there for them when they need it.
And the mistakes that we make, of course, is sometimes some parents are inclined to, and this is the helicopter or snowplow concept, protect their children too much so that they don't have any of those stressors, and then they're not going to develop independence. And then, of course, at the other, and this is sometimes harder to deal with, is in a life situation that has more of those stressors. Sometimes parents are unable to, or choose not to correctly, I'm loath to use the word shield, but sometimes that's the appropriate term. If a child's exposed to excessive quantities of stress, that's going to impair the development as well, and that's not productive.
That's when you get into more serious psychological
then
trauma and
psychological maiming. I mean, there's, I guess, physical maiming and psychological maiming.
Exactly.
Absolutely.
Exactly. And we need to protect them in that case.
Okay. And so you said also, if children are not doing well, it tends to mean that they either don't understand how to do well or why it's important to behave differently. So can you just talk a little bit about that, how that fits in?
What it makes me think of is the kind of things that you talk about with your kids over and over again. And it's kind of like, wait, why are we having this conversation yet again? But maybe
I just had like 10 things I said today just flash through my mind.
There you go. And in that case, it's that they don't know why it's important, or maybe they don't believe you about why it's important. So it might go back to that communication and their trust in you as a teacher. But you need to find, here's the thing about teachers, you need to find new ways to say the old things. Not everybody's going to learn this, what you want to tell them, the way you said it the first time. And that's just a fact.
For a couple of reasons. One, because we all learn things differently and process differently. And the other is just repetition. We need a certain number of repetitions before.
We can't forget that. Yep. We can't forget that. And we do as parents. I watch Chris, and I'm sure he watches me too, get frustrated with the kids. And we've only told them one or two. Okay. I'll tell one little story. So my middle child, Leo, he dressed himself for the first time. I think he was still in diapers.
He was definitely.
But he dressed himself for the first time, and I was like, "That's amazing, buddy! Wow. You get to do that every day for the rest of your life, starting tomorrow. In fact, we'll go to the playground as soon as you're dressed. And he didn't get dressed. And I was like, Leo, I said, we're going to the playground. I'm going to stick to this plan. This is me being strong, which turns out is stubborn sometimes rather than being steadfast. Important distinction. And I gave him a time. I said, at 9 o'clock, we are leaving, whether you are dressed or not. I will be happy to bring your clothes with you, but you are going to go to the playground in whatever you're wearing at that point in time. And yeah, that was too hard of a line, Luba, because my son was playing in the 50-degree weather in the playground. Because I believe in sticking with whatever it is you say you're going to do.
That's bad parenting. Just so we're clear, what we are and are not advocating for, that's bad parenting. So, and what that comes down to is assessing readiness, which is one of the principles that we try to teach in the book, is that you need to assess what is, which ties back into what we were talking about a minute ago, about what level of stressors is age appropriate. So we need to assess readiness. And for this 18-month-old child in diapers, the fact that he was able to dress himself one time by himself does not mean that he is now ready to do that task every day for the rest of his life necessarily. And that'll come maybe in a couple months or whenever it comes. And she jumped to that. Someone in this story jumped the gun and did not
I'm a work in progress.
Did not assess readiness appropriately, and then put too much stress on too young of a child, and the outcome, although obviously minor in this case, was predictable.
Okay. So the original question was what and how, right?
Yeah.
We have to be prepared to repeat ourselves, and if we can, in more and more creative ways to help them learn why something is important, and then help them how to do it. It's going to take practice. It's going to take repetition, no matter what it is.
So you also expressly say, this isn't about lecturing or kind of making just demands and so on. So because then you lose the connection part of it, and the kind of connection element of the teacher-student relationship. So how do you, a lot of parents, I think, don't tend to share a lot about their own lives with their children, because I think in many cases, maybe they don't want to scare their children that they don't have all the answers or whatever. But can you talk a little bit about that? Because I think that's actually quite common, that and that it hurts connection, because you mentioned in the book about sharing like deeper things about your own life.
Well, I think there are two things there. So first is lecturing, right? And that's very, very tempting. I lecture my kids accidentally all the time. I want to make sure that they understand that you clean the sponge before you put it back in the sink, whatever.
I was totally thinking about cleaning too. Seth carrying the toilet brush like around the house without the little base in it. We've gone over this a few times. So,
anyway,
and it's a line from I don't remember what movie it is, but it's the father in the movie like looking, and he's like, when did I grow my father's finger? Because there's this whole like listen to me kind of thing, and it like you alluded to, it's bad for the relationship, it's bad for the connection, and they just tune us out eventually. They've heard it before, or they've heard it too much, and so the minute that we can sit down and we can have a conversation, we can have a dialogue, and we can get to the same points, hopefully,
and admit to some of our mistakes of doing the same kind of thing,
but not all of them. This gets to the second point, is that we need to humanize ourselves, especially as our children grow older. Is this myth that we are all-knowing and perfect beings is eventually going to break down. And the more we've built it up, the more precarious that pillar will be, and then more disturbing it will be to our children when they find out that it's not true.
That we're not perfect, so that all of a sudden now they have less reason to trust in anything that we have to say, because they sense a lack of integrity there, right? But then also they aren't measuring themselves up to an impossible standard of the perfect parent. They need to know that people are fallible, and it's okay that they have strange emotions they don't understand, or make mistakes and forget things. I think being human is important to show in front of your kids.
I think that's the most important point, is that if you try to pretend that you know everything and that you have never made a mistake, then when your children inevitably make a mistake, they look, my parents are perfect, I've made a mistake, something's terribly, terribly wrong with me. And if instead they see, hey, look, my parents have made mistakes and they've turned out okay, And we joke about this all the time. Half of the businesses I've ever founded have gone bankrupt. I don't need to tell you all of my mistakes, but there are plenty of them, and you share them with your children. And so then when they encounter similar situations, they say, hey, look, my parents are good people. And despite all of the things that have gone wrong in their lives, they've turned out okay. That's normal and acceptable.
And I can see doing it in two ways. One, finding a story from your childhood that matches one that they're experiencing right now, or taking a story that just happened to you right here and in the moment and try and bring it into an example of their level. Say, like, for me, this was like X. And then also, I just thought of a third. We were playing a soccer game today, just out kicking the ball around in the park. And I thought, well, why don't we all share what it is that we grew from today? Practice doing what I say we should do, which is we talk about, well, this is RBR, isn't it? That we did something, we need to talk about how we did our best, and then reflect on what it is we want to do for the future and make future goals. So we did it all together, right? I'm just like you, trying to become my best self.
And so a lot of parents, especially right now, but even just in more typical times, are feeling, very overwhelmed a lot of the time. They've got a lot of adult responsibilities, and which are now magnified hundredfold. There's just a lot of parents, especially right now, just feel emotionally drained, and like they don't have a lot of capacity to be present, to notice, to interact in ways that aren't reactive, and so on. So what advice would you give to parents in this kind of educator role with their children, if they themselves if their cups are empty and they don't have a good way to fill them? I mean, like, they're just trying to get by.
And I like what you said there with the cup, because of course there's a martial arts story I'm sure you're familiar with about the student with the cup that's already overflowing and he can't learn anything more. But the flip side of that is the person with the empty cup doesn't have anything left with which to give. So when we talk about service and learning kind of balancing each other, that we need to be learning from sources that help us fill our cup so that we have something in our cup to share with our children. And as you said, in the more stressful times of life, and 2020 hasn't been easy on really anyone, it's more likely that we find ourselves in that situation. And so one thing to remember is that there are times in our lives when we are training, and there are times when we are performing, and that we go through these cycles. And so there are times when we are at our limits and we need to do what we need to get by. And there are times when we have excess energy, when we can either plow it into social media or we can plow it into training ourselves to be better next time we're being tested. And I suppose there are other alternatives. Those are the only two options. You can either waste your life on social media, or you can train and become a better version of yourself. That's kind of a very loaded statement. And so when we have the excess capacity, when we have the resources, when we're in a position of strength, now that's the time to educate our children, strengthen ourselves, fill our cup. And when our cup is running low, we just need to kind of do a little bit of the best we can. We also need to remember that of all of the responsibilities that we lay out for ourselves, raising children with functional, fulfilling lives is pretty much the highest. And so we all, as you said, in 2020 feel pretty spread thin. And I have a lot of sympathy for so many people who have had such a rough go of things this year. But making sure that we protect our children is, it's kind of the most important thing we'll ever do.
I have a lot of thoughts. They're all over the place. But one is that if we can often talk ourselves out of what we know is a really good idea, like sitting down with our kids and going over our values, for instance. If that's not something you've already done, brainstorming your values and coming up with your mission as a family and who you want to be, because that mission is what you fall back on when your cup is empty. And if you're sitting there with an empty cup and you haven't done it yet, take the idea, don't talk yourself out of it, sit down with your kids and just give it a go. Because you might find that you're not at the end of the rope like you thought. There's another 6 feet down there and you can pull yourself up with it. You might also find that sometimes your kids are going to be the ones who throw you the rope, that when you are down, they might just have an amazing amount of wisdom or presence or maturity, and that's going to bring you right up again as well.
And I think that's an amazing point. And that's the payoff. All of the energy that we invest in raising our children the best they possibly can, it all comes back to us. And I won't take up the time with the whole story, but about 8 months ago, we were sitting on the floor of an airport in Cambodia, trying to figure out how to get to Australia or the US or somewhere before all of the borders were shut. And we spent a couple hours sitting there packing away at our keyboard and texting people in different countries who were searching for flights. And we were unable to do so before Australia shut their borders and flights were being canceled to the US. And you turn to your kids at this point in time and you apologize. And my 8-year-old came over and patted me on the shoulder and he said, "It's okay, Papa, you tried your best." And like, you feel good about a lot of years and a lot of hard work. Like, he lifted me up. He helped me feel better in that moment in ways that I couldn't do for him. And so, that's part of a well-functioning family, is that we all give to each other with what we have.
And so doesn't that tie into the fact that in a teacher-student relationship, it's really not one way? I mean, the roles can at any moment reverse, right?
Of course.
Absolutely. I'll go right to being a martial arts teacher, that if you want to be a really good martial artist, and we'll say, if you want to be a really good human, then help raising other humans, because you're going to end up bringing up points and recognizing issues, topics, answers, questions that you really want to address in your own self. And if you're a person with integrity, you won't be able to tell your kids to be a certain way without doing it for yourself too.
And this ties back to what you brought up just a moment ago about admitting our lack of knowledge sometimes is appropriate. That when they say something, it's so powerful for the conversation. Just turn to those children. That's a really good point. I hadn't considered that before. Thank you for bringing that up. I'm learning something too. And that the difference between that tidbit of conversation and the lecturing that we're trying to avoid for developing communication, developing community, developing connection is amazing difference.
You can also have your kids teach you something. They will love that. It's one of the primary modes of service, and they're going to feel so strong and resilient because of that. They have something to offer you, and that could be they're teaching you how to play a game that you don't know how to play, or do a craft, or even something more.
The kids were all studying Spanish, and nimble little minds pick things up much faster than mine does. And I whisper to my 11-year-old, I'm like, "What does that word mean?" And it just makes his whole day every single time he gets to tell me.
Exactly. And that was the point I want to bring up, is we're still students too, Luba, to answer your question in yet one more way, that we want to be learning things along with our kids. So in addition to teaching our family values and exploring our family values with kids, find something that you all want to learn about together. We love learning history together in the Santillo family. We are learning Spanish. That's a little more begrudging. I'm doing my best, guys, as a Spanish teacher. But find something that you really want to learn together, a common interest, and that's going to build that kind of connection that you want. It's going to build the student teacher relationship. It's going to build the spirit of learning that we also talked about being so important to have for resilience.
Okay. And just, is there any kind of developmental stage, like in the tween years, where children are just going to be less receptive to their parents, and that, how do you kind of deal with that, in the tween or teen years? Should you expect some of that, or is it really all about the relationship and not so much about any kind of biological thing?
There are a lot of things going on in those years.
Oh my gosh.
But there are also a lot of like social tropes that we see played out again and again in movies and sitcoms and whatnot, because is sitcom still a thing to people? Sitcoms? Did I just date myself by using the term sitcom? That there are these archetypes of relationships that we keep playing out over and over again. And of course, they're always based on something. Like they don't generally come from nowhere. But
Margaret Mead did her study in Samoa, right? It was the groundbreaking anthropological study in Samoa that your teenage years don't have to be filled with the phrase was Sturm and Strong. It was a German idea that when you're turning a teenager, all hell breaks loose, storm and stress, and it's horrible. And she's like, no, over there in Samoa, they're just like happy as can be, and they're free, and they don't mind that they're growing hair. You know, it's great. I don't know how much Margaret Mead was correct, but I do believe that it's whatever we want to make of it. And we don't have to teach our children that they're going to turn into monsters when they're teenagers. It's just not true. I really had a good time with this question, Luba, because I turned to my eldest, who's now 11, and said, do you think our relationship has changed very much in the last couple of years, per se? You know, and what we teased out of it was, he needs me for different things now. He doesn't need me for getting dressed to go to the playground, for instance, as a perchance, but he does still need me. And I said, you know what? We talked about what it's like to make friendships that really last and are meaningful the last couple of days. I think you kind of need me to help you to help guide you through that process. So we still have a reason to be together, you know, and I know that you're going to want to go off and be your independent self, but nevertheless, we still have a good, strong relationship. What do you want to add there?
Well, Holly's point that they need us for different things. I pointed out to our tween son that, you know, that I spent the last week, because we're working on something ourselves, and I've been calling my parents for advice. You know, I'm in my 40s and I still call my parents for advice because they still know things that I don't know, because they've been on this earth longer than I have. Like, that doesn't go away because you turn 11 or because you turn 14 or you turn 18. The only thing that might happen is we might wear down that relationship. We might stop being in a productive way of interacting, and that is the mistake, and that's what we want to avoid.
That's what eats away at resilience, because when you get in a bind and you feel like you can't call on people like your parents who care about you most of all, then you don't have an opportunity there to help pick yourself up and recover from what it is that you're struggling with.
And if you haven't invested in the relationship, we talked about the fact that sometimes we're performing and sometimes we're training. If you haven't invested in the relationship when things are going well, then the relationship's not going to be there for you when it's going poorly.
Wow, that's a really important point. And is it more challenging in the case of children who are very self-contained and don't tend to express a lot of their thoughts and feelings and are reluctant? I mean, is there kind of a personality difference there where you might approach building resilience or at least developing the connection part that helps you then teach the resilience any differently in the case of children who are kind of more self-contained, less expressive, less sharing of their feelings?
Well, obviously, the concepts of resilience and the independence connection that goes into it is going to be the same for that child. But as you say, like, we express ourselves differently and we interact differently, and we gravitate towards different activities and different modes of communication. And so it becomes
the teaching phrase that comes to my mind, if I may, is mirror and match. That's a phrase we use in the dojo. Whatever it is that the student is bringing to you that day, if they're coming in kind of all soft and quiet, you want to be like, hey, what's up, buddy? Welcome to the dojo. I see you're ready for class. You know, you need to match whatever is going on with them, and then you open up the highway for two-way conversation rather than just a barrage.
And if we go back to the lecturing concept, if we have this child who's reacting in a particular way and we just lecture and I have my canned lecture, and this is, you know, don't put wet things on wood surfaces, and
you didn't say that today.
and clean up after yourself and load the dishwasher. And if you just say it the same way that you would say it regardless of your audience, then it's going to fall on deaf ears. But if you engage, because that's why the concept of having a dialogue is so robust. If you engage in a dialogue with that child, you know, some people you're going to have to work hard to get a word in edgewise. Some people you're going to have to draw them out. Some people you're going to have to sift through their jokes and sarcasm. Like, we're all different. But if you invest in having dialogue instead of lectures, then you will, and you do that well over the course of time, you will develop that connection, and they will be comfortable, even if they're always as you say, kind of internal, and they're always kind of quiet. They'll and reserved. That's fine. Some of us are that way. But they'll share what they need to share when they need to share it, as long as you keep working on the relationship.
Okay.
Luba, I
right.
just had a revelation thanks to this interview. I really appreciate it. Given my affinity for musicals, I realized, honey, that if you could sing everything you wanted to tell me, that would really help me understand.
It is also important to understand
it
that not always
Coming my
people will not always adapt to our desired form of communication, and that perhaps we need to figure out how to communicate their way.
Alrighty. So the three, what you call the three pillars of resilience. So we've talked about the importance of connection and independence, kind of in the relationship between the parents and the children. But then, and we've talked about the three components of resilience being strength, adaptability, and recovery. So then you also talk about these three pillars of learning, service, and integrity. Can you just explain briefly, how do all these things kind of tie together? How do the pillars tie in with connection and independence and strength, adaptability?
2 of these and 3 of these and 1 of these and 3 more of these, and we've got all of our lists, and they're important.
Yeah.
So the pillars, the learning, integrity, and service that you mentioned, really underpins all of this. Like it holds up the resilience, and by leading a life of learning, integrity, service, and we can define them. By doing that properly, we will generate the lessons necessary to develop connectedness and independence. I'm mixing up my own list, right? So learning, of course, is all about acquiring new information, but not just information, also capacities. So we want to send our children into the world with a certain quantity of knowledge, a certain quantity of capacity, and then most importantly is the love of learning and the interest in continuing to acquire new information and new abilities as they go through life. Most of the most interesting problems that our children will encounter in their lives haven't been invented yet. And so having an ability to continue to learn and grow and adapt is going to be very, very important to their success in life. And then the other end of that is the service. And this goes back to the cup being full and empty that you were alluding to earlier. That service is all about sharing your hopefully overflowing cup with other people. And it really is where a functional life transitions into a fulfilling and functional life. Is the best parts of life are captured in service. And then integrity underpins all of it, because a life without integrity isn't really a life at all. And integrity is all about being honest, both truthful and forthright, and fulfilling your obligations and making right if you ever fail to do so. And that's the difference between being a good person and a bad person. Learning and service make your life more functional and more fulfilling, but integrity is imperative to just being a good person.
And I think the phrase that Chris used that really helps to understand how this all connects together is that these are the conversations you want to have to develop the independence and the connectedness with your children. These are the lessons that you teach your kids, so that you are a teacher who inspires rather than requires to put your shoes away and keep wet things off of wood.
That's important too, though.
All that is important. And through these lessons, and also then bringing it back to broad scale, like, by the way, this is all about helping you develop resilience. Our kids know, like, okay, kids, what are the 3 parts of resilience? And they will tell you: strength, adaptability, recovery, and they know why it's important. And anytime that we have any kind of scrape on a knee, we can go back to that big lesson and help them tie it in so they know that they're on the right track. Does that help answer the question?
Yeah. And so I think the service and integrity parts, I think those are pretty straightforward to understand. Could you just talk a little bit more about the learning part and how parents can impart those lessons? Like you mentioned, in the earlier childhood years, there's a lot more guiding step by step. And then you said, but then it kind of evolves into more stepping back and encouraging self-directed learning. So could you talk a bit about the role of the parent? And I mean, I think it's more obvious in the earlier years, the children are dependent on us for everything, but kind of that journey that makes sense for a parent to go through, and how to encourage more self-directed learning. And then what is the parent's role in creating the right environment and modeling and so on.
Oh, she used some really good
Yeah.
hint words right there.
I know how to answer this question because you used the relevant words. That's good.
Thanks, Luba. Well, sir, you definitely want to be sure you have a good environment for learning in your house. And that might be different per person, per family. For me, my learning environment is pretty quiet. I think other people learn best with music. For me, my learning environment is best when it's kind of tidy, but maybe just a little bit crafty and painty. But at any rate, know your environment and understand whether or not it's inhibiting or allowing, conducive to good learning. And then modeling.
And we want to make sure. So again, when we talk about learning, we want to make sure that we're not just thinking about getting our child's homework done today, though that's obviously important. But rather instilling in our children a love of learning that will last their whole lives. And that's the harder part. Like getting the homework done today, like that's comparatively easy. We have a tendency, I don't know, well, let's go back real quick to our childhood, or our children's childhood. When we talked about learning how to walk, they were eager to learn how to walk, not just from us, but in general. Like they were excited to learn how to walk. That was exciting. And then you cut to 10, 15 years later, a lot of children complain about school. They complain about homework. They complain again. I sometimes consider that just one of those social tropes that we have it in the TV shows and the movies. The kids hate school, and so everybody thinks that's what they're supposed to do. Our kids love learning. Every kid's different, and every environment's different. Every situation's different. But there's no reason that children have to intrinsically dislike learning. And I think one of the most important things that we can do for our children is to teach them to love learning, or maybe it's better said, help them keep the love of learning that they had when they were very, very young and carry that through to adulthood.
Modeling can help. Chris pointed out, gosh, we always read our books after the kids go to bed, like, oh, finally they're in bed.
No.
Now we
this
can
was
read.
When they were younger. They stay up later than I do now. So that's changed.
Right. But if they never see that you read and you're always telling them, pick up a book and read, it doesn't compute, right? It seems like a lack of integrity, going back to that very important word. Your question also made me think of, I have my kids doing an independent study board. So we talked about all the things that they want to accomplish. And that's really important. It's not necessarily, there's some things on there that I want them to accomplish too. But what are you interested in? Like crafting and building is up there. My son's really into computer programming right now. And I just need to make sure that he has the opportunity to explore that and the environment. But I also have this board up that says, okay, why don't you go ahead and mark down when you actually have done something so that you can assess yourself. Another integrity practice, right? Have you actually done what you set forth to do for yourself? Have you kept your promises to yourself? I had one son who was really struggling with that. So I thought, okay, we need to actually lay it out. I'm gonna map this for you of how you know when you've done something. And he failed. The first 2 weeks, he absolutely failed to mark off his own boxes. And then we talked about strategies, reflected on how to do it better. Reps, do your best, reflect, and come up with a better plan. And now he's smooth sailing. It's wonderful to hear them talking about, okay, today I'm going to do this and this and this. They absolutely plan their own days and accomplish their own goals that they set for themselves. It's marvelous because we took the time.
And I think that the modeling that both you and Holly alluded to is arguably the most important. They're looking at us and they're seeing that we have these lives that if we're doing a good job, they want to someday have. And what do we do in these lives? And what's the statistic I read? Like after high school, like 50% of adults will never pick up a book of any importance ever again. What are we demonstrating to our children? Are we showing that we are through life? And there's two parts to that. One is making sure that we're continuing to be the kinds of continuing to learn and continuing to grow people that we hope they grow into. And then are we drawing that lesson out? And this is what Holly mentioned about if you only ever read after your kids go to bed, then they don't know that you read. If you spend 18 years, if you, during the course of your 18 years that your child is in your house, never tell a lie of any kind, but you never discuss honesty, they won't get that lesson from you. So there are two important points. We need to be consistent with the lessons that we are teaching, but we also need to draw the lessons out. Like, look here, I was honest here. This is important. You should be honest like this also. And sometimes it's hard and go through all the different things and the fallibility, the fallible nature of humans comes out sometimes too. But I'm on a 88-day streak of Duolingo learning Spanish on my phone. and we speak Spanish at breakfast because, as Holly alluded to, she speaks Spanish. It's just the boys and I that are learning, and they learn faster than me, but I'm plugging along and I am sticking with it to the same way I want them to stick with it.
I got another thought too, Luba, that I find the most conflict if I'm trying to do one thing and someone else is trying to do something else. So if you have a child who's struggling to get homework done, create some homework for yourself. Find something that you want to learn. Sit down and like, okay, it's homework time. Let's all do our homework. Rather than, okay, I'm over here cooking dinner while you're supposed to be doing your homework. Okay, well, we want to eat something. So why don't we all work on cooking dinner? Oh my goodness, I enjoy that so much more than feeling like, well, I have my duties and you have your duties and you better do them. You know what I mean? And that might not work for everybody, particularly maybe no one wants to relinquish control of their kitchen. I get that too.
All right. I think I wanted to make sure I went through kind of the things I had highlighted from the book. I think we've hit on basically all the points, except I think just one thing. You talk about kind of steering the children toward more and more self-directed learning, but then, so how much control do you cede to the children over what they learn, when they learn, how they learn it, and so on? Where do you as parents kind of decide how to manage that?
Can I non-answer for you?
Non-answer. What's a non-answer?
Non-answer. You know, every kid's different, every situation is different. And this goes back to us helping our children to make responsible and unemotional assessments, kind of back to what we were talking about earlier about when should you be strong and when should you adapt, is and parallel to the idea of assessing readiness. You know, what level of self-directed learning can our children can accomplish at this age? You know, how much can they do on their own without me hovering over them? And if you have a 4-year-old and you have this hour-long reading and writing project that they're supposed to do by themselves, that's probably not going to go over really well. And if you have a high school student and you say, okay, I have 2 math problems I want you to do, that's kind of absurdly simple. And so figuring out what they can do where they are, wait for it, challenged but not overwhelmed, is kind of the sweet spot. And again, every kid's a little bit different, and some kids are going to be, have an easier time with math and a harder time with reading, and vice versa. We all know our children are unique in their own ways. But the key is to continually be guiding that rather than assuming we know the answer, rather than ignoring the question entirely, and rather than assuming we're going to be following some very predictable trajectory, because we aren't. We're going to be customizing.
And so I think you also mentioned in another part of the book about part of what can, I guess, negatively affect connection is children feeling the burden of expectations from their parents that they can't meet. So how much do you expect? How do you decide what to expect and when of your children in terms of learning?
Well, don't expect your 18-month-old to put on his own clothes the second day after we tried it. It takes practice. I wish I had a good solid answer for you. It's about noticing what they are capable of, being open to new possibilities. And
then going back to the idea of sharing stories of our own fallibility, so that they're comfortable with whatever. When they do fail to meet our expectations, they realize that that's something that happens sometimes, and that's okay. But then we have to be willing to go back, and it almost parallels the discussion of being strong. When do you adapt or when do you strong? When you say to your child, like, you need to do X, Y, Z today, and they don't do it, well, sometimes it's on them, and oftentimes we're parents. We've done this before, some of it before, and oftentimes it's on them. I'm going to stand strong, and I'm going to say, now you need to do it, and here's your punishment for not following through when you were told to. And then sometimes we also need to be willing to say, you know what, that was an unrealistic expectation of my child at this stage of their development and whatnot. So I think you're asking the right questions, and I think as long as we're willing to take 2 steps back and always accept that in any given situation, the difficulty might be the behavior of the child, but also the difficulty might be the behavior of ourselves as the parent, and figuring out, being willing to ask that question honestly of ourselves, I think we'll get to the right place at the right time.
Yeah, I think the phrase you had used before is thinking of the parents as benevolent dictators. Like that it's not yeah. I mean, would you still kind of use that term, or
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Yeah,
But with an equal emphasis on both of those things, or
it's just that we want them to know that their voices are meaningful to us, and we are going to listen to them. But in the end, we're the parents. It's not a friendship. It's not an equal relationship.
In our family, they outnumber us. If they decide they're going to vote on something, we could lose.
That's right.
Yeah, no, it's important that they, as Holly said, that they know that their voice matters to us, but they don't get to make the ultimate decision. We get to decide what's best for our family.
Right. All right. Well, thank you. I think we've covered a lot of ground here, and hopefully it's been helpful to our viewers. And of course, there's a lot more details in the book should parents want to dive deeper into that. So once again, it's called Resilience Parenting. And thank you for this wonderful conversation. Like I said, hopefully a lot of people will benefit from it. And thank you for taking the time.
Thank you, Luba. Thank you, guys.
Okay, bye.
Bye.